a tafsir session in which we go through verses of the Quran. And I was thinking about what sequence we should take going forward. And I thought, well, let's start right at the beginning. Let's start with chronologically the earliest possible accounts that we have in the Quran. Like, where does the sequence of events which would become the narrative of the Quran, where does it begin? And indeed, it begins before time. It begins at the beginning of existence. And through the course of creation, the Quran covers how our world came into existence, how other worlds came into existence, how angels were formed, how there was this period of cosmic explosion which the entire universe burst into life. All of that culminating finally in the creation of Adam and the entire dhurriya, his progeny, then developing on earth through the Anbiya, through the stories of the prophets, until we reach the time of our holy prophet. And then we have in all of the verses which discuss the prophet, how he lived, how his message was spread. And then that inevitably leads on to the verse of Quran for after the prophet passes away. And then what the future is for the day of judgment and for Yawm Qiyamah. In this loose structure of human history, right at the beginning, like the first part is creation and history of time. So here now is a presentation in which we go through in as best sequence as it's possible for me, because it's a little bit hard to put these verses all together. What happened at the beginning of existence? Before creation, at creation, and after? What were the sequence of events which led to where we are now? Now, a few points on methodology about this session. This is not an academic tafsir class. Now, if we were doing academic tafsir, we would go through a verse and I would say, okay, here is Allama Tabataba'i's opinion. Here's Ayatul Khui's opinion. Here's Agha Nasim Karim's opinion. And here's how it links to philosophy or science or whatever. We're not doing that because that approach in the past, especially when I'm in, education environments, can become quite heavy. Okay. What we are doing is known as thematic tafsir. Thematic tafsir is when you have a certain theme you're interested in and you collect all of the verses together about that theme. This is different to tafsir by surah, in which we go through verse by verse and explain, for example, surah Mutaffifin, surah Naba, and we go through each verse. We're not doing that because the story of existence exists across different verses of different surahs. Also, in terms of methodology, as I explain each verse, in addition to a sequence, I'll mention what some scholars have said about this verse when relevant. I'll also mention the hadith of Ahlul Bayt, which relates to this verse or this concept. And at times, because this discussion becomes quite philosophical and becomes quite scientific, we'll refer to other discussions from ulama who have tried to understand these verses to explain their own other theories, like Mullah Sadra, which we'll discuss, and Allama Tabatabai, and a few others, who are very interested in the history of time to prove other things. So what we're going to commence with is a series of sequence of events about how the universe began, which verses were revealed about these different facts, and which words of which scholars and a hadith of Ahlul Bayt can help explain these verses and put them in order. At the end of the talk, there'll be a little opportunity for questions. You can all use the chat, but really I'm happy if you just ask a question at the end. When we do questions, if you just say, by the way, I didn't understand this part, or can you explain this part a little bit further? And at the end, we'll also have a chance to consider what the future is for this series, because it's not clear to me, and inshallah, we see how today goes. Okay, a Quranic history of time. Where do we begin? Agha, can you go to the first slide, please? Now, the first moment or the first existing, area that we can look at is the moment of kun fayakun. When this moment happens, we have at our disposal the first moment in which we know that time and space operated. Because before this moment of kun fayakun, arguably there was only Allah Azza wa Jal in his essence. There was nothing to record or to know what happened because there was nothing which existed. It was a time of true bewilderment. But from that chaos, Allah says, kun fayakun. Now, the verses which speak about this, there are many. The ones which refer to existence, I've mentioned. إِنَّمَا قَوْلُنَا لِشَيْءٍ إِذَا أَرَدْنَا. When Allah says, when we want something, when we have some irada, then أن تقول له كن فيكون. We say be, and it is. Similarly, when Allah has some amr, some order which He wishes to create, إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون. All it takes when Allah has this irada for this amr, when He wants to create something, is simply to say قال كن فيكون. Now, kun, fa, yakun are three different parts of this process. First of all, Allah says kun. He says be. Now, this act of just saying be is the first snapshot of who the Creator is. There is no doubt that Allah Azza wa Jall's existence is the same before and after He creates. He is the same. His essence is unchanged. But what be does serve as is an exhibition of who He is and how He creates. So when He says kun, we see who He is. For example, we see that He creates. Before this, we had no idea that Allah was a khaliq, a creator. We knew He potentially can do anything, but we never saw it before. But the moment we see kun, we see existence. So already we have a proof for Allah's existence coming from this right now. That here is a being who is the first cause, the uncaused cause, for whom there is nothing which caused Him, and yet He is the one who initiated the chain of events which become everyone's chain of existence. Sometimes we say, where did I come from? I came from my parents. Where did they come from? They came from their parents and their parents and their parents. And we go back, and we have to end at some point. Or we say, this earth, where did this earth come from? It came from the clashing of meteors which created it. Okay, where did those meteors come from? They came from stars and stardust. Where did those stars come from? They exploded from black holes. Where did those black holes come from? Well, there must have been some beginning point. That all goes back to kun. One of our scholars, Mushtaba Musa Villari, discusses this kun. And he argues that there is no creature who can claim to have any amr, any command, without gaining it from Allah. Because the first command, innama amrahu, the first amr of Allah, came at this point of kun. All authority goes back to this kun. Also, he argues, no one can claim to be a separate agent to Allah anymore. You can't claim you are separate to Him, or you gain your wujud, your existence from somewhere else. It can only be from Him. Because we have that definitive start point, all existence has to go back to this start point. All wujud, all knowledge, all qualities, anything which exists goes back to this one moment of kun. And here he says, Aghalari, that just as one command brings into existence this entire universe, it is also the first cause of everything which would follow. Okay, so that's kun. Then we have fa. If you see kun, fayakun comes up both times. Fa is, he says, be, then it is. Or be and it was. This means there was something in between Allah's hukum and it creating. And that thing is time. That thing is the process of change. If you would try to imagine if there was no universe, although this is the thing which logically we can't imagine, but maybe we have our own versions in our mind of what nothingness looks like. And in that plane of adama, of ghayr wujud, of no existence, Allah says kun, and somehow through some process, the whole universe exists. But when He says be, that be has to take place somehow. And that way it takes place is fa. It's how it takes place. And our scholars argue that this is the process from non-existence to existence. There was no world, now there is a world. There was no humans, now there is a human. There was no sun, no stars, and now there is. And that process is going from not having something to having something. This is important because, as Allama Tabatabai argues, anything which changes, which goes from one thing to another, only does so because it lacks something. There's no other reason why something would change. He gives an example. When you're hungry and you eat food, that's because you have the deficiency of hunger. And when you go and you eat some food, some breakfast, which I should have at some point, when you eat, that simple action is the perfection of your hunger. Now you're no longer hungry. And in that process, you've gone from a deficiency to perfection. Or another example he says is, think of atoms. Atoms which are initially so unstable and moving until they settle into a fixed point. That's because they lack something and they gain something. So whenever you read kun fayakun, what you're really reading is there was something which was lacking, something wasn't there. And Allah, by saying be, and it is, gave that thing its perfection, or gave it the road towards perfection. Now, the thing which didn't exist, which should have existed, is not Allah. Allah always existed. It's us. We are the ones who, in this early stage of existence, before we didn't even know that we existed, but Allah was thinking about our own perfection. And in the fa that we see, He set into motion a process of change, which would gradually result in our existence. Okay. Muhaqqiq al-Tusi, another scholar, says that every action must have a motive. It must have a plan. And the plan here is perfection, right from the beginning. But then we end in yakun. So we say be, and it is. Once it is, we now have something around us which we call creation. Fayakun, something exists. And as Aghalari says, that thing which exists is now a proof that there must be a creator. Because now there is a whole world which has within it messages and within it parables for Allah's existence. The sun and the moon, which we're gonna see, they all point towards Allah. The earth and the humans. Everything has within it a code. And that code pointing back towards Allah. So, إنما أمره إذا أراد أي شيء أن يقول له كن فيكون. Now the question is, if everything exists, Allah says be, and it is, what was the first thing to exist? Next slide, please. The first act, which was the first unique act, was one which was not replicated by anything before. This is very important. Sometimes we read in the Quran where Allah creates, for example, He takes dust and He makes Adam from that dust, from clay. Or for example, Prophet Isa creates a bird which flies, and in the verse of Quran, He takes pieces of clay, puts them together, and He creates. Kun fayakun is not like this. This is the first time, and some argue the only time, where Allah created something without creating something before it. There was no resources which He made. It's not like He made the wood from which He then carved the building. No. It's not like He made the stone from which He then chiseled the figure. No. There was no resource. This was the first time. Allahu alladhi rafa'a as-samawati bighayri amadin. He created and raised the heavens with no support. There was no scaffolding or nothing which existed before He wanted to make heaven and earth. Something happened directly. The first thing which existed. He's the creator of all things. There's no doubt about this. And in the act of creation, we have this word called ijad. Ijad is when you create something without following it before. No template, no existing plan, no predestination, pure creation. From Allah's knowledge into real existence directly. He created something so imminently right at the beginning. You see that little red dot? That's a timeline. And what we're discussing now happens right at the start. Allahu khaliqu kulli shay'in wa huwa ala kulli shay'in wakil. Allah Azza wa Jal created all things and also watches over all things, meaning He knows from its existence from right at the beginning until the end. Allama Tabatabai argues in Tafsir al-Mizan that when we read that Allah is khaliqu kulli shay, He creates all things, what we mean is there is not a single thing which resembles another thing. If you see a child, that child might have features of its parents, a bit like the dad, a bit like the mom. You know, when you see a baby, you think, oh, this looks like its mother, this looks like its father, because you're seeing certain genetic features which came from somewhere else. Allama argues at this stage, what came next was not like anything. It was a new substance. It was a new production. It was not from imitation. It was not created in pieces, like gradually. No, the first thing which was to exist, which we're going to look at, was unique. It was some sort of amr, which came directly from kun fayakun. And we have many ahadith about this idea that Allah Azza wa Jal did not copy from the first thing which creates. Imam Ali alayhi salam says in a narration that when Allah creates something, no other originator took part with Him in His creation. And there was none other who had power to even assist him in his creation. In another narration, he says, he is without partner who would have wanted to help him to create these wonderful things. Allah's creative force is entirely unique. And so when Imam Ali alayhi salam speaks in Nahj al-Balagha, in khutbah number 1, the first khutbah, in which he discusses creation, he says, and I'll quote what Imam Ali says, and think of that last verse, هَلْ مِنْ خَالِقٍ غَيْرَ اللَّهِ? Is there anyone who creates except Allah? Imam Ali says, he initiated creation initially and commenced it originally, without undergoing reflection, no thinking about it, no making use of no equipment, with no innovation, no movement, without experiencing any aspiration of mind, where a person says, I wish to create, none of this. He allotted all things in their times and put them together with variation of their properties and determined their features before creating them, realizing fully their limits and confines and appreciating their propensities and intricacies. He knew the potential before he created it, but no one had to convince him of how to create. He just did. This means that if you think about Allah Azza wa Jal having knowledge of you, of who you are, of where you came from before you existed, it means that although Allah knows everything you're going through right now, in the action of khilqat, of creation, there was no deliberation. There was no thinking, I'll create this person who will then do this. No, it was instant. Everything became actual at that time. We have this argument also that when we say that Allah watches over all things, we also mean that he is watching over how he has created things, how they develop over time. Because there was no time before kun fayakun. There was no space-time motion, none of these things. But once he says kun, be, and it is, time exists. So when we read, for example, وَلَا كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَكِيلٍ, Surah 39, verse 62. By the way, I'm not going to be sharing the slides after, sorry. So if you want to take notes or you're interested in these verses, you'll have to write down the verse numbers. So when we say Allah is a wakil, he's a representative, he's a witness of everything, we mean that he's seeing how potential becomes actual. About this, to make sense of this, our sixth Imam Ja'far Sadiq alayhi salam says, that Allah Azza wa Jal never ceased to exist. There was knowledge in his essence before there was anything to be known. He was all hearing before there was anything to be heard. In his essence, meaning in his own existence, he could see before there was anything to be seen. He had power before there was anything over which to exercise power. When he created things, all knowable things came into being. And his knowledge then embraced that which was already knowable. His hearing then heard that which was heard. His sight saw that which was seen. His power then became powerful over that which existed. So Allah had all these qualities already, but we had never seen them actualized until there was something to exist. And then we saw them. Somebody comes to the Imam. Maybe they're a bit confused, like we might be. And they said, but yeah, Imam, at this time when Allah creates everything, was he moving? Like, did he change something from eternity? Did he himself change at this time? Imam Sadiq says, Allah is much greater than this. Changing, motion comes into being. The act of moving from one thing to another is a quality which happens when you exist, when you're being created. But Allah was eternal. He's always existed. So when we say Allah can speak, he's always had that quality even before he says, kun fayakun. Right? So this first unique act we're seeing of kun fayakun is when Allah Azza wa Jal, in his glory, exhibits a quality which none of us had ever seen before. And he creates something which has never existed before. What's that thing? Can we go to the next slide, please? What is the primary substance? What came first? What was there in all of existence which Allah created initially? Because we have this idea that Allah didn't create everything all in one go. No, there was a first thing from which other things flowed. And the verses of the Quran which indicate this, خَلَقَ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ بِالْحَقِّ. We created all things with truth, with some truth that existed with all of these things. Or خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدًا. That we created all of you from one living entity. Now, in terms of the first verse, Allah says, I created the heavens. He is the one, the heavens and the earth, according to some sort of haqq, some truth. What is that truth? Sayyid Nasr in the Study Quran argues that creation, this first moment of creation, is like revelation, it's like wahi. And it's in that time when Allah reveals something and that thing becomes the truth, but revelation and the word of Allah are already linked from the beginning. When he says kun fayakun, that's like revelation. And there is some truth which that is going back to. The first thing which existed, which all revelation now follows. Some people argue that first thing was aql, was reason. أول ما خلق الله العقل. We have hadith which say this. The first thing which existed was aql. So this verse is haqq, is about reason. Not human reason, rationality itself. That narration says that Allah created something first, said come forward, it came forward. He says go back, it went back. And he saw this thing as responsive. So he says, this thing I will name you aql. Okay. Other scholars argue the first thing which exists, and there's a lot more about aql in philosophy, about aqul being the first existence, but that's not really our topic. Others argue it was the spirit. أول ما خلق الله روح. The spirit. The first thing which existed before everything was the spirit. And from the spirit came everything. That's one view. The view which seems more convincing than both of these is from the Holy Prophet himself, in which he says, أول ما خلق الله نوري. The first thing which Allah created, Azza wa Jal, was my light, was my nur. This was the first thing. The reason why this view is more convincing is because it falls in line with how Allah creates. And Allah Azza wa Jal has a love of Ahl al-Bayt at every moment of khilqiyat and creation. In other occasions. إني ما خلقت السماء مبنية ولا قمرا منيرا ولا فلكا يدور ولا بحرا يجري ولا فلكا يسري إلا في محبة هؤلاء الخمسة الذين هم تحت الكساء. I didn't create the heavens and the earth. ولا قمرا منيرا, and the moon and the stars and the sun which turns and the oceans and the land, except out of muhabbat for you, Ahl al-Bayt. So we see it then. In other narrations we see, for example, Allah says, if it was not for Hussein, I would not have created heaven. Or Hussein has been created, heaven is created from Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. This kind of language. Or I would not have created hell if not for the enemies of Ali ibn Abi Talib. That kind of approach. Ali an qasiru nari wal jannah. You are the one who splits between heaven and hell. You will find, and this is no exaggeration from the Shia, wherever there is khilqiyat, creation, there is Ahl al-Bayt. So the first thing which existed, if we take it to be the nur of Muhammad, what it actually means is when Allah says kun fayakun, the first time he created a light, a nur. And according to these verses, that nur was haqq, it was the truth, and it was wahid, it was one. And then there was a dialogue with that nur, with that light, of who is your Lord? And Allah replied, Anta Rabbukum, you are the Lord, Ya Allah. Some narrations indicate that light then split into more than one. Others say from the beginning Allah says you are the nur of Muhammad, and then that light splits into two or into three or into five, depending on different narrations. But at some point there was for sure 5 different segments of nur. What happened next is either that 5 became 12 and from 12 came creation, or that 5 gave all of creation from them. I don't want to go through the hadith about this because although they are extremely exciting, they are a rabbit hole I fear we will not recover from. And also, this is a very specific view of creation, which even not all Shia subscribe to. If you're interested, go to Al-Majlisi, go to Hayatul Qulub, Volume 1, and a bit in Volume 2, and look at the first chapter on how Allah creates. And you'll see all of Majlisi's ahadith about the nur of Ahl Bayt being the first thing which existed. The Prophet says, I was the Prophet when Adam was between soul and body, meaning before he even had an existence. I was a physical existence. I was the Prophet. Prophet says, me and Ali were worshipping Allah by his throne for 12,000 years in isolation. Or narrations which says that, there were 74,000 periods in which there was only praise of Ahlul Bayt to Allah Azza wa Jal. There was a time where there was just this one primary substance, which is the most pure love for Allah, which we call Nur Muhammad. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. After this, the world is created. There's a lot of verses there, and I'm going to go through them, don't worry. But there's a lot of, the world is created. And it is somehow from this nur of Muhammad, or that first nur which was existing, whatever name you want to give it, from which Allah used that as a resource to then create everything else. So the first time He creates was ijad. It was unique. Nothing was like it before. The second time He creates is from the first thing He creates. And the third thing is from the second thing. And now every level of existence is a darajat, is the level which is abstracting from lower and lower and lower from that primal existence, that opening motion, that first substance. A word of warning for all of you who are listening. We don't actually know exactly how the world was created. We don't. And neither can we use Quran conclusively. Because here's the issue. I've presented something like 10 verses, which go on to the next slide, which some ulama have used, but other ulama put them in different orders. And when you put it in a different order, the sequence changes. And it's very hard to know which one came first. Did Allah create? Did this verse happen before this one? Because even when a verse says thumma and then, that doesn't necessarily mean in time. That could just mean and then Allah did it in terms of and then in priority. Or, this is then next to prove this certain argument which comes in the next verse. So we don't exactly know how Allah created. Here is a chronology of verses which might indicate how He created. All right. The first way they might create is awalam, the disbelievers, awalam yara alladhi kafaru an as-samawati wal ardi kanata ratqan. Do they not see that the heavens and the earth were joined together? Samawati wal ard kanata, they were one. And after they were one, ratqan, fafataqnahuma, and then we split them, we opened them. This would imply that the first thing to happen was one became two. Heavens and the earth were one being. They were one phenomenon. And then we opened them up from each other. Okay. And then He directs Himself ila samai wa hiya dukhanun. Allah directs Himself to the heavens after this, and there was smoke. Dukhan meaning vapor. Or substance, or smoke is used in many translations. فَقَالَ لَهُ وَلِلْأَرْضِ. And then He says to the earth and to the heavens, أَتِيكَ طَوْعًا أَوْ كَرْحًا. Come into existence either by choice or by compulsion, because by following me. قَالَتَهَا عَتِينَا تَابِعِينَ. And then the heavens and the earth replied, we exist willingly. So it went from one thing splitting into two, and then from the two, they become vapor. The next verse signifies what would happen after they settled into forms. So the verse here says, فَقَضَاهُنَا سَبْعًا سَمَاوَاتٍ فِي يَوْمَيْنِ. And then He ordained 7 heavens, which were existed through 2 different periods. So now what was before vapor has become 7 layers. وَأَوْحَى فِي كُلِّ السَّمَاءِ أَمْرَهَا. And we gave every single layer its own amr, its own order, its own affair. وَزَيَّنَ السَّمَاءَ الدُّنْيَا. And then we adorned the lowest heaven. Dunya here means lowest, because the word dunya comes from being low. We gave it its own بِمَسَابِيحَ. We gave it its own stars and guards. وَحِفْظِهِ. So every heaven, the lowest level of heaven, has stars, which would suggest they're similar to our stars. And this Allah Azza wa Jal is the mightiest and the one who has all knowledge. Later on, we will read that He created the heavens with tibaqa, with their own levels and darajat. So there is this theme of the heavens having levels. Okay. What happens next? وَالسَّمَاءَ. And then the heavens, which we're now interested in, بُنْيَانَهَا بِأَيْدِي وَإِنَّا مُوسِعُونَ. And then we constructed the heavens, and then we expanded space. So after there were 7 levels of heaven, if we follow this chronology, and each level the lowest level has its own stars, but each level has its own fixed form, we then expanded space. So in another verse, Allah asked the people who are disbelieving in him, أَنْتُمْ أَشَدُّ خَلْقُ وَأَمْرِ السَّمَاءِ. Do you think that you are harder to create for me than the heavens? سَمْكَهَا. He made it. He created the heavens. فَسَوَّاهَا وَأَعْتَشَ لَيْلَهَا وَأَخْرَجَ السُّحَابَ. He raised the heights of the heaven. He gave them all their own states. Then he made night and day. وَبَعْدَ ذَلِكَ ضُحَاهَا. And then he expanded it again. So Allah Azza wa Jal, through each level of creating the world, keeps expanding larger and larger and wider. It went from being joined together to being two, then to being smoke, then to being heaven and hell, then for them to be levels of heaven, and then for the lowest level of heaven to expand into space, and then the lowest space, that space which exists, to then be raised high. To understand if this chronology makes sense, we then turn to Nahj al-Balagha, in which Imam Ali alayhi salam speaks of the same moment in history in his own words. He says, and now think of these verses that I've just mentioned. When you hear Imam Ali alayhi salam, see how it fits into those and if you think it fits in or not. When the Almighty created the openings of the atmosphere, he expands the firmament and the strata of winds. He then flowed into it water. Remember the previous verse? Allah created everything from water. And there were waves which were stormy, and each surge leapt on another. He loaded it on dashing wind and breaking typhoons, ordering each of them to shed back. And then he gave control to the wind over the vigor of the rain and gave each of them a limit. The wind blew under, while water flowed furiously over it. Then the Almighty created forth wind and made its movement sterile, gave it motion, intensified its position, and spread it out far and wide. Then he ordered the winds to rise up deep waters and to intensify the waves of the oceans. So the winds churned it like the churning of curd and pushed it fiercely into the firmament, throwing its front position in the rear and the stationary on the flowing till its level was raised and the surface was full of foam. Then Allah raised the foam onto the open, and this vast firmament, this vast land, and made there 7 skies. And he made the lower one a stationary surge and the upper one a protective ceiling. Subhanallah. And a high edifice with no pole and no nail to hold it together. Then he decorated them with stars and the light of meteors, and he hung in it the shining sun and effulgent moon under the revolving sky, moving, sealing, and rotating. This is one of the most beautiful parts of Nahj al-Balagha, which we read in today's discussion. Signifies to me motion. Everything is changing and developing at its own pace for its own plan. And as part of that motion, the same themes come up from the Quran. The 7 heavens being separate, the lowest of them being given stars, and each one being supported in a holistic way, like they're all part of the same process. All right, can we go to the next verse, please? The next slide. The story of creation continues. Qul, say, so this is the Holy Prophet now teaching the people. أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَكْفُرُونَ بِالَّذِي خَلَقَ الْأَرْضَ فِي الْيَوْمَيْنِ. Do you disbelieve Allah who creates the entire world in 2 periods? I'm not going to say 2 days for Yawm, I'll tell you why. وَيَجْعَلُونَ لَهُ. And are you going to say equals with him? ذَلِكَ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. This Lord of yours created the earth then, after there were all of these levels, in 2 different periods, 2 different days. But we don't say days. Why? Because the earth was not rotating the sun in the way that it is now, for there to be 24 hours of a day. And indeed, later on in the Quran, we read that on the day of judgment, 1 day is equal to 1,000 days of yours. So we can't use day like 7 days or 6 days. We can't trust them in terms of days. But they were periods. And the earth existed over 2 periods. Then now we have the earth, which has taken 2 periods, 2 days, cosmic days to exist. Now it finally exists within the lowest level of the heavens, surrounded by stars. Each one has a fixed place. There is now an earth. وَجَعْلَ فِيهَا رَوَاسِيَ فِي فَوْقِهَا وَبَرَاكَ فِيهَا وَقَدَّرْ فِيهَا أَفْوَاتَهَا فِي الْأَرْبَعِ أَيَّامٍ. And then he established mountains standing firm on this earth, mountains being the first thing, and bestowed blessings on the earth to give everything on it nourishment in 4 separate periods. So we're not saying days, we're saying periods. The earth now has 4 phases in which it exists and is created. And then after this, وَهُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ لَكُم مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا ثُمَّ اسْتَوَىٰ إِلَى السَّمَاءِ فَسَوَّاهُنَّ سَبْعًا سَمَاوَاتٍ. And then he directed himself to the heavens, the verse we saw before, in which there were 7 different levels. وَهُوَ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ. And that's the climate we're in now. One earth, surrounded by stars, beneath 7 levels of heaven, the lowest of which we have direct access to. If I had presented this a little bit differently, the order changes and the sequence changes. Which one, did heaven come first or the earth came first? Did earth come from heaven? Are they from the same form? And there are many discussions about this. One discussion which I think is particularly interesting and which might blow some people's mind is a narration from the Imams in which they says that Allah has created 100,000 lanterns at this time, hanging from the sky. And he has placed all of the heavens and the earth, everything we've been discussing, all of the heavens and all of the earth and all of the things inside them into one of these lanterns. And only he knows about the remainder of them. At this point, what we've just said, 100,000 of these things were created. And the entirety of the lowest level of heaven, which we know, was in just one of those lanterns. So the question is, what's in the rest of them? Who exists in these other lanterns of existence? If Allah went through all of this process to create the heaven and the earth, which we've gone through, and it all exists within just one of the verse says 100,000 different hanging lanterns in the sky, what's in them? Is there life? Are there other beings? Are there other earths? Are there other versions of me? Allama Shahristani is a scholar who wrote about this and collected all of the hadith about multiverse and the cosmic moment of creation and all of these things. Says that he thinks that these lanterns are like solar systems. These samawat of the lanterns are like solar systems. Says why? He says, first of all, a lantern is oval in shape, and according to contemporary scholars at the time, there is a circular shape to the solar systems, to those systems in which you have a star and you have orbits and planets orbiting around it. He goes, second, a lantern spreads heat and light, and a solar system has within its center a sun. So maybe the word lantern here is being used to describe a solar system in which there's a source of light right at the beginning. Third, he says a lantern is floating in the air. It's not fixed to a wall. It is something which is hanging in space, just like a solar system. And finally, he says if you consider a lantern, even though it has a light in the middle, the light sometimes turns to one side or to the other side. It doesn't stay in the middle. It flickers to one edge or the other edge. Just like how in the solar system, it is an oval. It's not a perfect circle or spherical. Yeah, its wavelength can be distorted to have an oval shape. So maybe lantern here implies a solar system. And that would imply that there are 100,000 solar systems in which there are 100,000 versions of the earth and the sun and the moon. What this then leads to is the question, well, what's inside those different areas? Why did Allah create them? Because remember, we're not saying there are different solar systems. We're saying there are this, just like there is an earth which exists, there's an earth just like this one in all of those ones. And each one, of course, needs Allah in the same way. Each one was created in the same form. Each one came from kun fayakun. The Prophet says that we cannot appreciate Allah's greatness. Everything goes back to Him. But the question still remains. Were there other worlds? Can you go to the next slide, please? Just like I said, the world was created. Now let's consider if the worlds were created. For example, here, ذَلِكَ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Allah is the Lord of the worlds. What if we imply worlds to mean different universes? If this view is correct, and there are different planets just like Earth existing in different planes of existence, it would not be in contrary to how ulama have interpreted some verses of Quran. For example, our fifth Imam says, perhaps you think Allah has created only this single world. And you think that Allah has not created anyone other than yourselves. No, by Allah. He's created 1,000,000 worlds and 1,000,000 Adams. And you are simply the latest in the world with the latest Adam. He says it clear, don't think you are alone. You are the last of a species or of a, a, a sequence which has a million other Adams. Adam is your first, fine, our first. But who says he's the only one to have existed? There's one narration of the Imams which also say that Allah also created a planet which had a different length of day to our day. And the inhabitants of that planet did not even know that there are people who have disobeyed Allah. Whatever form they're in, there is an entire species which we have no access to according to this narration, and they had no view that Allah had ever been disobeyed. They would never have believed that there was tughyan against Allah. Sayyid Shahristani, the scholar who has collected all these narrations together, also looks at this verse and says that Allah has look, here's a hadith from Imam Sadiq with a strong chain which says Allah has created 12,000 worlds. Each one is larger than all of the heavens and the earth, and none of them knows about the other world. So we have the heavens, you have 7 levels, and of the lowest level is the earth in that form. But this hierarchy exists in the duplication of 1,000,000 or of 1,000 or 12,000 in this narration. The question now is, do all of these things exist right now across the world, across the universe? Or are these all our world in different times? It's a delicate point. I hope you're following. 1,000 Adams, fine, but maybe those on this same earth, there was a species, they lived, they died. Another species came, they lived, another species lived and died. Maybe it's just a sequence of species coming and going. But it's when the Imams say, and they exist, but they don't even know of each other, where one questions, maybe right now, there are certain barzakh, certain barriers between worlds, which Allah has enforced to protect one from another. And Alameen, Rabbul Alameen, Rabbul Alameen, all of these different verses of the plurality of the worlds means there are different universes amongst them. One of our great philosophers, if we can't go too deep, Mullah Sadra, is very interested in time and how time works. And one of the theories he establishes is that even if there are different worlds which exist, they all have their own time within them. It's not like mine came before yours and yours came before mine. No. All of these different universes have their own system of space-time within them, which for our discussion means it's not impossible for there to be multiple universes all running at once. It's not impossible. And if it did exist, it existed at this time when the worlds were created, at this initial moment. Can we go to the next slide, please? After we have the worlds, after we have the heavens and the earth, now we have the creation of the ruh, of the spirit. Bear in mind, I'm not talking about human beings. I'm not even talking about angels yet. We'll come to it. We're just talking about the spirit. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. And when they ask you about the ruh, قُلِ الرُّوحَ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. Answer, this ruh is from the amr of my Lord. It's from his order. أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. But you have very little knowledge about this thing. This term ar-ruh comes up a lot in the hadith about what happens at this moment, after the creation of the worlds and before what happens next. There is this spirit which exists. Another verse says, Surah 16 verse 2, يُنَزِّلُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ بِالرُّحِ. We sent the angels with the ruh. So the angels aren't this spirit. It's not them. وَرُوحْ مِنْ أَمْرِي. The ruh which came from my command, which was the previous verse of 1785. There's this special spirit which was created from the beginning, which was sent with the angels, but it's not the angels. عَلَى مَن يَشَاءُ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ. And it can go to whoever Allah wishes from his servants. And the angels come down and أَنذِرُوا أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنْتَ فَاتَّقُونَ. And they say that there is no deity worthy of Allah, so be wary of me, be wary of Allah. But it's the ruh which he sends. It's the ruh which he gives. The question is, what is this spirit? Now, Sayyid Akhtar Rizvi, one of the scholars who comments on this verse, says initially it's kind of vague. What spirit are we talking? Is it a human spirit? Is it spirit of angels, spirit of heaven, spirit of Ahlul Bayt? Like, what is it? This doesn't mean Allah's avoiding the topic. It means you will not be able to understand the reality of the spirit. Just be aware that there was one ruh min amri Rabbi, which was existed at kun fayakun just after. right? And it's from this ruh that he sends his guidance. His angels come with this ruh. The Quran is sent through this ruh. Some say this ruh supports the Anbiya, the prophets, that when they need something, Allah sends this ruh. So something, maybe it's an angel, maybe it's like the archangel, the first angel, the angel from which all other things were existed. This is one view. And those who believe this view might rely on Imam Ali's Nahj al-Balagha, which we'll come to later. Others say that this ruh was just the word of Allah, the amr of Allah. It's his command. And wherever he needs to send it for guidance, he sends it. And so there's an extensive debate about whether or not this ruh is the Quran. Is it the case that the Quran, think about this to yourself. When did the Quran begin? I'm trying to simplify one of the most important topics in theology, but think about when did the Quran begin? Was it, all right, let's think about it. Was it when the Holy Prophet hears the words, speak by the Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi, speak by the permission of your Lord? Is that when the Quran begins? Is it when when Allah tells those words to Jibreel before Jibreel brings it to the Holy Prophet, for example? Is it at Mi'raj, when the Holy Prophet is ascending to the heavens and returns with the Quran in his heart? Is that when it was formally actually created? Was it even created? The position of Ais Lakhoui in this regard is the Quran is the kalam, the speech of Allah, and it's a part of his essence. And it has always existed in the knowledge of Allah. And when he sends down revelation or amr or wahi, or in this case ruh, we are seeing a portion of the Quran, but that Quran in its perfect form in Lawh al-Mahfuz always existed with Allah. So some say maybe this ruh is about the word of Allah. And Allah sends his command, his amr with the prophets to understand what the Quran is. This is one view. About Surah 16 verse 2, so that we send on the angels with the Spirit. We have a scholar called Tawa Saraja, who's a contemporary scholar, and he quotes Shujai in Malaqat, a book, an older book, that maybe this spirit which Allah sends is some immaterial aid. It's like an ally that you call upon when you need help. And it's there to strengthen the Prophet Isa as Ruh al-Qudus, for example, to strengthen him at that time. It's like a force which exists, an energy in the world. And others have seen this energy and interpreted it as differently. But we in the religion of Islam interpret it as the thing which aids angels and the Holy Prophet when he needs it and brings revelation and accompanies him. It's not Jibreel, it's greater than Jibreel. Perhaps, he then argues, maybe angels that we exist now all came from this one ruh. They are all tanazzul, manifestations of this one spirit. Maybe we human beings came from this ruh. Maybe our soul, which was created, which we'll see later, وَنَفَخْنَا فِيهِ مِنْ ruh, that we breathe in my soul, maybe that soul came from this one soul, this one spirit which existed. This discussion goes on for a long time. What we do see here now is the first mention of angels. Now angels exist. And Allah sends them down with a mission. How were angels created? Let's turn to Nahj al-Balagha. Again, for Imam Ali's most beautiful description of this time. Imam Ali says, then he, Allah, and again, look at the verses and think of how Imam Ali's explanation fits into these verses. Then he created the openings between the skies and filled them with all classes of his angels. Some of them are in prostration and don't kneel up. Others are in kneeling position and they don't stand up. Some are in an array and they never leave their designated position. Others are praising Allah and never get tired. The sleep of the eye, or the slip of wit, or the languor of the body, or the effect of fatigue or forgetfulness does not affect them. And among them, angels are those who work as bearers of his message. So among the angels, there are only some who are delivering the message. Those who serve as speaking tongues for the Prophet, and who carry to and fro his orders and injunctions. And among them are the protectors of his creatures and guards of the door and the gardens of paradise. And among them, so we're getting lower and lower and lower in terms of number, are those whose steps are fixed on this earth, but their necks are protruding in the skies. Their limbs are on all sides, their shoulders are in accord with the columns of the arsh of Allah. Their eyes are downcast before the throne. and they've spread down their wings under it and rendered themselves like curtains of honor and screens of power. They don't think of their creator through image. They don't impute him through attributes of the creator. They don't confine him within abodes. And they don't point to him through illustration. That is to say, they know Allah. They see Allah. There are these mujarrad, non-physical beings which exist even now in different planes of existence, each one having a duty towards the creation. All right, let's go to the next slide, which I think is the penultimate one. We then go now to a conversation which happens at this point. A conversation amongst the souls. So after the ruh has been created, the next mention we have is of the arwah of multiple souls in a famous verse, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّتِهِمْ. And Allah brought all of the Bani Adam together, brought their souls together. Remember, Adam's not even been created yet. He's brought all of their souls together. مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِهِمْ ظُهُورِهِمْ ذُرِّيَّتِهِمْ وَاشْهَدَهُمْ. And He's made them bear witness to themselves. عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ. And He's asked all of them, أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ? Am I not your Lord? And in this plane of Alam of Dhar, in which they are just every single spirit which is going to exist on this earth, all of them say, قَالُوا بَلَا شَهِدْنَا. We all say, yes, you exist. We bear witness. أَن تَقُولُوا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّا كُنَّا عَنْ هَذَا الْغَافِلِينَ. You cannot now say on the day of judgment that, oh, we didn't know, we weren't aware of Allah, we didn't know who He was. We don't get to say this anymore. Why? Because this conversation happened in our past, where Allah created all of the souls before sending them to their bodies, and He brought them all together. We have many narrations on this period of time, of this ancient conversation, in which the Prophet says that I was the first one to say, قَالُوا بَلَا. When all of the souls were gathered together, and they were asked, أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ, am I not your Lord? He says, I am the first one who says, you are my Lord, Ya Allah. And Allah brought me closer to Him and chose me as His messenger. In another narration, the Imam says that when this conversation happened and all of us were there and all of us heard the word, Alastu birakum, am I not your Lord? Before all of the other messengers after the Holy Prophet, Imam Ali and the Imams answered, Qalu bala ashadna, we bear witness, you are the Lord. And they came closer to Allah. And at that time, everything came close to Allah based on its recognition of His Tawheed. And the angels witnessing all of this says, Ya Allah, we have no objection to what's happened. We have seen what's happened. We are witnesses to Banu Adam. We have seen what they have promised you. And what they have promised you is obedience, ita'at, recognition, ma'rifah. This whole plane of existence, Shaykh Mansour al-Ghaid explains, of Alam al-Dhar, is the world of particles. There was no matter at this time in the way that we have now. You did not have a body at that time. You just had your soul, just had your spirit. And later on, when Allah wished to create you, He sends that spirit from that plane all the way to the loins of your father and to the womb of your mother. And then upon procreation, that soul then enters the body which is formed on this earth. But you and me, our true reality existed from this time, from this conversation. Some scholars argue that was this thing in time, or is this conversation happening all the time? I don't want to get into this, but what they ask is it the case that where this red dot is now on your screen, that's when this happened, after the spirit was created, before Adam? Or is it the case that every day we are being asked, Alastu birabikum, am I not your Lord? And every day our soul has its own relation to Allah, irrespective of our body. Our soul right now has its own relation to Allah, has its own connection to Allah. And we don't even know how well we are doing in proximity to God sometimes. But always Allah is asking us and questioning us internally, am I not your Lord? And always the fitrah, the nature, always responds and says, قَالُوا بَلَا ashadna, we bear witness, you are the Lord. And when does this conversation come up? On the day of judgment, when people disobey Allah. And He says, do you not remember that conversation which I told you and you recognize my existence? All right. After this conversation, we then see the first creation. If you go to the final slide, Adam is created. Created how? In terms of his physical body. His soul may have existed before. ثُمَّ السَّوَىٰ وَنَفَخْتَ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. And Allah proportioned him and then breathed into him from his soul. وَجَعَلْ لَكُمْ سَمْعًا وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ. And Allah Azza wa Jal made for him hearing, gave him vision, gave him a heart, and made him grateful. Adam being the first, Adam meaning Adimul Ardh, the one who's created from this earth, from dust, and he exists. Now, I don't want to go into how Adam was created, how he was created. It's a whole nother discussion, which maybe we can have. And I don't want to go into what happens next. What we have done in the course of today's discussion is gone from the period of non-existence until the period of existence. We've gone from the process of Adama, of non-existence, all the way until we now have our ancestor Adam. But as you have seen, there are many periods which come before. The heavens and the earth, the souls, the universes, the cosmic stars, everything part of Allah's plan, which all began with kun fayakun. If you go to the next slide, please. The end and the future and any questions. So that ends the discussion of the first session. Thank you so much for listening. Are there any questions? I can see some in the chat. Please use the chat if you want to ask questions, or open your mic and speak freely. I don't mind. Isn't it the theory of expansion? I'm reading a question now somebody's asked. Isn't this a theory of expansion, meaning expansion of the universe? Isn't it interesting how Allah mentions it 1400 years ago, and it was just discovered in 1925 by Edward Hubble? Here's a question from Sister Nasib. Good question. Is this not the theory of the universe expanding? Don't we teach this to our kids in a textbook, that the universe is expanding, and now here's the proof. The Quran proves it. I'd be very careful of this, because although it's true that the universe created with motion, with expansion, and it's true that initially it expanded, we have to be careful about using verses of the Quran, how we understand them, and assigning them to scientific theories today. Because theories change all the time, and those theories, because I'm not a scientist, might have elements which are against the Quran. They might have a different sequence or an order. There are many scientific refutations of what we just mentioned anyway. And of course, there are replies from Muslim scientists. So yes, the universe does expand in a purely Quranic dialogue. But this might not be the same of Hubble or of Dawkins or of any other thinker. And we should be careful of saying this is linked to that theory. Okay, another question. Was the time created the same time as this world was created, referring to Mullah Sadra's work on time? Good question. Before Mullah Sadra, the belief was that time exists externally. How do I explain this? We have two positions in philosophy which are always, until Mullah Sadra, were competing. One says that the most important thing is wujud, existence. It's the most important thing and the only thing. Another argument is not about existence. Once you have a cause, you exist. It's about what exists, the quality, the quiddity, known as mahiyya. I can't go into detail, but these are two debates. And before Mullah Sadr, the view was that time is something which was created from the moment of existence, right? From the moment Allah says kun fayakun, there's time and it continues like a continuous chain, right? The Ash'arites did not believe in time in this way. The Ash'arites earlier, they didn't believe that Allah says kun be and then it is. No, they believe in something called aada. Aada for them means that this is just how Allah does things, habit. There's no link between things. There is just habit. The Ash'arites believe that Allah Azza wa Jalla was not involved in the actions after kun fayakun. So the angels then created was not necessarily linked to the wujud of Allah. Everything had its own separate existence. Mullah Sadra came and says, no. Time, space, motion, movement, all these things exist within who you are, within what you are. It's not about whether or not you've been existing, you have a cause. No, it's about you. For example, does Allah experience time? No. Is it because he was caused or uncaused? No, it's because he's Allah. He doesn't experience time like everyone else. It's not in his nature. Fire burns. Where does that come from? It comes from the nature of fire to burn and for that fire to end. Everything comes from its own nature. That was Munasadar's answer. And yeah, we can't go into it in more detail because I'm not prepared on a Sadrian dialogue. A question from a 7-year-old. I feel honored that a 7-year-old was listening. Why do we call Allah He and He isn't a boy or girl? What a super question. From Sister Fatima Raza. Very good question. Why do we call Allah He? Some argue it's grammatical, it's linguistical. When we say Huwa Allah, Huwa in English is He, but in Arabic is for neutral things. It's actually the default. Even in Arabic, when you look at different words, having different prepositions, for it to be female is applied to a word or a concept. For it to be male is the default in the Arabic language. Nothing to do with male or female or boy or girl. So in answer to your question, to Sister Fatima, who's 7 years old, let me rephrase this. Allah is not a boy. Allah is not a girl. Because Allah cannot be defined by being a guy or a girl, a man, a woman. He's not like this. He is like no other thing. The only thing which is man or woman is Adam and Hawa when they were created, and then all of their children. And the only reason we say Allah is He did this, He did that, is because we're not translating Arabic properly. We've not got a better word to use. Allah is not a man. Allah is not a he. Neither is Allah is a she. Allah is a being like no other. But really good question. A question from Mustafa, how does the soul connect and respond to Allah? Okay, if we mean ruh, the ruh min amri rabbi, we mean this was directly created by Allah and returns back to Allah. And it has a very imminent communication to Allah. In fact, when the Holy Prophet is going on Mi'raj, he sees and experiences the ruh after he passes the highest levels of heaven, and he goes to the arsh of Allah, and he reaches Sidratul Muntaha, like the furthest anyone has been, and he reached level aw qaba qawsaini aw adna, the area where he was as close to the word of Allah or to the glory of Allah as a bow or even shorter. He had already passed and seen the ruh as he passed. So in answer to your question, the ruh is one of the existing beings which Allah keeps closest to him, and he sends with whom he wants. He allows the ruh to support whichever prophet he wants, and the ruh accompanies whichever book he wants, but it's entirely by his amr. It's not because of angels, it's not because of the arsh of Allah, it's not because of the Quran, it's from Allah Azza wa Jal directly. Very good question. Any other questions on this? I'm checking my phone if anyone sent me private messages. I already answered these ones. Any other questions about this? What's the reference of Ruh and Surah Qadr? This is a good question. وما أدراك في ليلة القدر تنزل الملائكة والروح فيها بإذن ربهم من كل أمر. Some people, and I have read in the tafsir, says that this ruh refers to the ruh of the ruh, which created in the beginning. That we revealed the angels and the spirits, which were all following the word of Allah. Here's where it gets interesting. According to the verse of this verse, and according to our understanding of Qadr, at least once a year, all of the angels descend to the earth. Fine. And the ruh comes onto the earth. Fine. Some people say that when we say our Imam is Sahibul Amr, the one who has order, it means Allah is sending him his amr in terms of his ruh continuously, at least once a year. So the Quran mentions وَخَلَقَ الرُّوحَ مِنَ الْأَمْرِ اللَّهِ. We've created the ruh, which is from the word of Allah, the command of Allah. And we have somebody on earth, in our Imam, whose entire role it is to receive the amr from Allah, which implies, quite beautifully, our 12th Imam has direct access with the ruh of Allah, direct communication with this ruh. And at least once a year, as promised by this surah, he's experiencing the Spirit of God in terms of his command. What does Allah want of this earth? What does Allah desire of the 12th Imam? And he experiences it directly. Not like the angels, like Sahibul Amr as he is. Thank you so much. Somebody has said, good talk. We'll chat on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter, please, known as Abbas, for other dialogues like this. Another question. If we want to understand better the nature of Allah's creation, do we add the use of science or not? We'll finish quite soon, by the way, maybe within the next 5 or 10 minutes. Maybe 10 minutes. We'll keep sending questions. The question was, if we want to understand the nature, do we add the use of science or not? Okay. For sure, we can't just add scientific theories to the verses I've mentioned and say, this sounds like evolution. This sounds like Big Bang Theory. This sounds like, no, we can't do it like that. And neither can we say that Islam is in compliance with an existing theory of science. But here's what we can say. We can say that whenever Allah creates something, He then ensures that His creation obeys the laws of nature. Allah, who creates the laws of nature, then follows them. So if we were to have the same discussion about how the earth was created, we could do so by looking at science, and we could technically link each theory of science back to the verses if we knew how they link to it like directly, but obviously we don't. So Muslim scientists, Mullah was a scientist, as are others, thought that we should do tafsir and link it to our observation of the known universe. This is not controversial when it comes to proving God's existence. For example, look at the way the sun, look at the way the moon follows the earth. In this way, we have to follow Allah, like parables. That part's fine. It's when we start saying that these two periods of splitting is like the splitting of the atoms in fusion, or the expansion of the heavens is like the expansion into dark matter, from gray matter into dark matter, as according to the argument for the expansion of the universe. And I think a person needs to be a mufassir and a scientist to do this in order to be conclusive. So I'm a little bit skeptical about using science in this way, but I know that science complies with this. Of course it does. But we trust in the metaphysical nature of the Quran more than the physical nature of the science of our day, which could change. 150 years ago, science said that the earth was flat. Today, science says it's round. Imagine what it will say tomorrow. If we were having this chat 100 years ago, would we be prepared to use these verses to argue for the flatness of the earth? Well, let's start with Quran and then see what scientific theories comply with it. Let's not start with science and then try and fit a verse according to it, as many people will try and do. But yeah, science and Quran is a very important distinction. Another question. The root you just said about spirit, I want to ask you about the soul. Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? Yeah, so that dialogue, so the question is about, that verse of Quran which says, Alastu bi rabbikum qalu bala ashhadnakum, when Allah says, am I not your Lord? That is Allah Azza wa Jal asking the human souls, our souls. It's not Him asking the ruh. If the ruh's there, but the verse says, وَقَالَ إِلَى الذُّرِّيَّةِ بَنِي آدَمَ. He's asking all of the descendants of Banu Adam. And because our soul is immaterial, our soul exists before our bodies existed. And just like our soul was put in this body, it will go out of this body. Our soul had a home before our physical body in dunya. Here's how it goes according to the narrations. Allah creates the immaterial soul. Mujarrad. It has no form. It exists in Alam of Dhar, the world of souls where all the souls exist. When there is a complete cause for it to come to earth, that soul leaves that plane and enters earth upon conception or upon the birth of a child, depending on when life begins. Let's say conception for this argument. The soul now enters the physical body, a new container made of flesh, made of dust. That body dies because human beings are going to die. That soul doesn't die. The soul will never die once it begins to exist. It goes to a new body in barzakh. It remains in the barzakhi body until that barzakhi body dies. Then it goes to a new body in Day of Judgment. And the Day of Judgment body looks similar to the one you had in dunya. That same soul goes from the container of barzakh to the container of Day of Judgment. And then, based on what happens after a person's judgment, that person with their new body and new soul either goes to heaven or to hell. If they go to heaven, they are given a body which is appropriate for heaven. If they go to hell, they're given a new body appropriate for hell. We know this because we read about pain and pleasure of akhirah. and only a physical body can feel pain or pleasure, right? The soul goes through these cycles of one body to another, one container to another. It's almost like one piece of clothing to another. The soul is like this, and each body is like something you put on and take off. And that conversation happened when that soul was in its first body in the beginning of creation. And it goes through that process. Thank you for the question. In some majlis recently, we've come across the interpretation of Ruh as Sayyidah Fatima sallallahu alayha. Can you please shed some light on this, please? Depends on what we mean. If we mean that when Allah said, when the Prophet says the first things created was my Nur, and now we're discussing what is this Nur relating to the Holy Prophet and Bibi Fatima, I'm with you. The narrations about Sayyidah Fatima being heavily involved in the first of creation, I mean this narration, this narration, Allah says to the Holy Prophet, if it was not for, Allah says to Imam Ali, if it was not for the Holy Prophet, I would not have created your Nur, or would not have created you. And he says to the Imam Ali, if it was not for to the Prophet, if it was not for Ali, I wouldn't have created you. But if it wasn't for Sayyidah Fatima, I would not have created either of you. Those kind of narrations, they're authentic and everything, but they defy our understanding. If the Holy Prophet's the first Nur, I get it. If Allah creates him because I'm Ali, I get it, because I'm Ali alayhi salam and him are part of the same spirit, and they have this kind of very intimate relationship in terms of their Nur, fine. But if he says, I would not have created any of you if it was not for Fatima, okay, here's where it gets more difficult. When we read in the narration that that the whole world came from the Prophet Muhammad and Imam Ali alayhi salam, but certain other things came purely from Sayyidah Fatima. So you have this one Nur from which everything comes to exist. That makes sense. The Imams are the Amr of Allah. They are the Imams of Allah, fine. But then Sayyidah Fatima, she's not an Imam. Not in the terms of Wilaya, in that sense. She's not an Imam. And yet she has been given the same role, if not higher, in creation, in khilqiyat, than even the other members of Ahl al-Bayt. Why? Why? The Prophet, I get. The Imams as one entity we understand, because the Imams gain their authority from Allah as being the Imam on this earth. The Wilayat of Allah, they have the Amr of Allah, fine. Sayyidah Fatima is neither a Prophet nor an Imam. And yet her role in khilqiyat, in the narrations, is higher sometimes than all of them. Why? So I understand why, if you heard in a majlis, Sister Sabina, that Sayyidah Fatima could be considered Ruh. But she can't be considered Ruh in the narration I mentioned about the Ruh, Ar-Ruh. That's not Sayyidah Fatima. Because I've seen no indication why it would be, but also it's not, Sayyidah Fatima being, her role, if anything, her role is greater than this Ruh that I mentioned. Because this Ruh was created after. What came first was Nur of Muhammad, and that's where Sayyidah Fatima is involved. So I would not say, it depends on what the recital of that majlis meant. Next question. Is there a difference between the Ruh referred above and our spirits? This question to Sister Khulud is a beautiful question, because the philosophers have argued that there's a difference between the aql and human aql. The philosophers argue there are 10 levels of aql, 10 levels of aql, of rationality. And none of them are about human beings, none of them. They are only about pure knowledge. And the lowest level of the 10 has itself 10 levels. And it's not just conjecture, they go through what these levels are. And the lowest one is linked to human rationality, right? But that is not to say that this is the same thing which is created at the beginning. When some people say, أَوَّلَ مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ الْعَقْلِ, the first thing to exist was aql. That's not the same as human reason. They are separate entities. And the same is about ruh. The ruh is different to human ruh. Now, Sayyid Shahristani, who I quoted, Sister Khulud, does mention that it's possible that the ruh has different manifestations. And the lowest of those manifestations is the human soul. It's possible. But I add, and maybe you would have some thoughts too, that the human soul has to go through a lot of stages to connect to the ruh. The ruh which empowers Nabi Isa as Ruhullah, which is separate to him. It will most likely be separate to us as well. And maybe in some irfani dialogues, mystical dialogues, when we discuss unity with Allah Azza wa Jal, and Ibn Arabi discussing Wahdat al-Wujud, which we won't go into, mainly because it can get a speaker cancelled these days. But in those discussions, they do argue whether or not the human being can unite with the ruh. And if you're interested in this, I would direct your attention towards readings of Wahdat al-Wujud. Very good question, as always. How can Allah watch all of us at the same time? It's a very good question. How can Allah watch from Aiza? A really good question. At once. There was a narration which I didn't mention earlier, which says that, I did mention that Allah Azza wa Jal could see before there was anything to be seen. This means that Allah Azza wa Jal has an essence, a dhat, and in his essence are all of his qualities, everything. His knowledge, his wisdom, his kindness, he has all of it. And he doesn't need us to exist to see us. He knows how, he has this knowledge of how to see before this. And Allah hasn't got his physical eyes or a physical brain or physical ears. So he doesn't need to be in one place to see something. He can be in any place. And more than this, we need Allah for us to exist continuously. Because at every moment of our lives, we could change into any other eventuality. If you think about it, existing is very chaotic. It's very traumatic to even exist. Any second from now, anything could change. Why do I even have stability? It's because Allah is continuously feeding me with wujud, with existence. And because, Sister Aiza, we have this connection to Allah where He's always, His existence is so closely linked to ours. We exist because of Him. We can see because of Him. We can hear because of Him. He has full hikmah of us, full wisdom of us. And to finish this point off, we have this view that in order to give something, you must have it yourself. So in order for us to see, Allah must have given us our own sight. He must have given it to us ourselves, how we can see. And if Allah gave us sight, Allah must have that sight Himself. He must be able to see all things. But remember, Allah can watch all of us at the same time because He hasn't got eyes like we have. His sight is eternal. I think there's no more questions. There's just an announcement that the next session will be on Sunday, 29th of November at 10 a.m. About this, okay, we'll do Sunday, 10 a.m. I accept, fine. But about this, what shall we do next session? Now, I think that what we could do is continue going through history and looking at, this light is coming in now, and looking at, for example, what happens next? How was Prophet Adam created? How did the verses go through his creation? At least until the creation of Prophet Adam, him speaking to him, seeing the names, his dialogue with Satan, with Iblis, that I will not worship him, his tarki awla, the issue which he had, being sent to earth and what that means, and what it meant for Adam to be on earth. We could go through that, I think. Or if you're more interested, we can use this approach and look at a different theme. For example, civilizations of prophets. How does human society change over prophets using verses of Quran of different Anbiya? We could do this. Or I was thinking we could, since we look at beginning of time, let's look at the end of times. Let's use the Quran to understand what happens at the end of all of existence. What is our future? Literally the future you're seeing. What's our timeline? We could do this. If some of you are interested in specific verses, surahs of Quran, which you'd like to see this approach, I'm happy to do that too. One thing I was not sure of before was like what level to leave this lecture, because we were like, are children going to attend? Is it going to be for adults? But based on the feedback, I think that people are engaging with the content. Yeah, so please, I would say after this session, please feedback to the organizers of Al-Muntazir and tell them what you are interested in. And more specifically, what aspects of my description did you like? What aspects do you think were not needed? Because, we are learning about how to do these sessions. Do you want more philosophy? Do you want less science? Do you want less hadith, more hadith? Do you want more grammatical tafsir, which we could do, but I resisted? Like, do you want that kind of approach? Let the organizers know. And inshallah, before the 29th, we'll discuss. This is the end, but I've just seen a question which is a bit close to me, which is, Do you really get connected with our loved ones who have died before us in Barzakh? Now, I want to mention one narration just to finish this, which is from the Holy Prophet, which is about connection to loved ones. And maybe if any of you have people who have passed away who you miss, or who loved ones who you want connection to, despite being separated by different worlds, this hadith is good. The Holy Prophet's with his companions, and while he's there, he starts weeping, he starts crying, and they say to him, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "Do you not know that your loved ones are coming to you now on this day? They're descending to you for something from them. They want something from you." And he says, they were your brothers. They were the ones who died for us. They were the ones who lived for us. And now they have become dust. And they come from you desiring something. And they said, "What do they desire?" Prophet says, "I see they want some sustenance from you. And the way to give it to them is through charity. Through giving sadaqah, through charity, you are feeding them rizq, even whilst they're in barzakh." The Prophet keeps crying. I personally, when reading the narration, I think, he's thinking of of Hamza, or of his loved ones who he has passed away. Maybe his children, the Prophet's own children, or maybe he's thinking of those who will pass away in the future. I don't know. So bearing that in mind, and the question was, if someone has passed away and they are not in this realm, how can we connect to them? They love for us to give sadaqah in their name, charity in their name. And this makes me want to read a Surah Fatiha for our dear brother, Sayyid Abbas Zaidi, who was an important part of Al-Muntazir. And it makes me think of him and all those who have passed away. And I urge all of you, before reading Surah Fatiha, to consider giving sadaqah for them in their name, and pray that Allah Azza wa Jal elevates their status, gives them sustenance on account of our love for them and our sadness at being parted from them. So to end our discussion, please read the Surah Fatiha, but first, please salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.